Hello, everyone, and welcome to Outspoken. I'm Regina, President and CEO of In Our Own Voice, National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda, and I'm really glad you're here. You know, when people hear Supreme Court, it's easy to think about the black robes, maybe legal opinions, constitutional debates, or headlines that flash across our phones in June before disappearing. But as I was preparing for today's conversation, I was kept asking myself something very different. What do these decisions actually mean when someone wakes up tomorrow morning? Because the court isn't just deciding legal questions, it's shaping whether families can stay together, whether people can vote, whether immigrants can build a future here, whether communities have the stability they need to thrive. And those aren't separate issues, they are all connected. And that's what RJ is really about. It's what it asks us to pay attention to. Our lives are shaped by the intersection of our identities, our opportunities, our health, our families, our communities, and our democracy. So that's when we say RJ isn't simply about the right to have children or not to have children. We're saying it's about all these other things. It's about all the conditions we need to raise those children. And those conditions need to be safe, they need to be healthy, and they need to be in sustainable communities. That's what this conversation is about today, people. It's about power, it's about belonging, and it's about the country we are becoming. Now, one thing I've learned over the years, and is that institutions can feel distant until they don't. A court decision suddenly affects your family, or it affects your health care, it may affect your neighborhood, it may affect your ability to vote, or whether someone you love has to suddenly leave this country. For Black women, girls, and gender expansive people, those moments rarely happen in isolation. And those are what we're going to be talking about today. People don't want to see their identity as just one thing. They want to see them as connected, they want to see them as nuanced, and they want to see our lives as layered. So, when people talked about the Supreme Court decisions this last month, it wasn't a question for me about who won. Instead, I wanted to ask, what do these decisions tell us about whose lives are protected, whose are made more vulnerable, and what kind of futures we're building together? And there's no one that I'd rather have that conversation with than who I am joined with today. Whenever our country is wrestling with questions about democracy, civil rights, constitutional change, or whether there's only a handful of voices I'm going to immediately look for. Sherrilyn Ifill is certainly one of them. She's the former president and director of counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She served on President Biden's commission on the Supreme Court and has spent her entire career helping us all better understand not just what the law says, but what justice requires. Sherrilyn, welcome to Outspoken.
Thank you, Regina. I'm thrilled to be with you.
I'm so thrilled to have you here. I want to start with the big picture because I think a lot of people have been seeing these things through the headlines, but if I'm honest, they feel disconnected from one another and people really don't understand. So for people who have seen the headlines but may not know how to make sense of this court term, what do you think they truly need to understand at its foundation?
Yeah. Well, thanks so much. This is really an opportunity because I worry that especially our people don't understand precisely the way in which so much of what is happening is going to affect our lives. So let me say it this way. Now, can you see me? Because I can't see me, so I'm not sure if everything is cool. Everything's cool?
I do not see you. Try ticking your camera on and off one more time.
Okay. It's off. That's on. Not seeing it. Thoughts, folks?
Now we can certainly hear you though.
Isn't that weird? I mean, I was on.
Yes, you were.
I thought I was maybe going to be let into this room or something. It says you're in the show. Everyone can see and hear you, but I can't see and hear me.
Why don't we have you, since we're live, why don't we have you exit and come back in?
Sure.
And in the meantime, I'll talk a little bit about my reflections on these last couple of days. It's been quite interesting watching the news. I've been traveling all over, been in several states. And, there's been a lot of commentary about the White House Correspondents' Dinner, a lot of things happening across the borders. And, I think this is all very instructive, illustrative of what this conversation is going to be about. There you are. I'm so glad.
Okay.
I was just talking about the news lately, and because I talked about the headlines that we saw in June when the Supreme Court decisions came down. But actually, these headlines, we're seeing things like play out in real time. And so
you tell me where you want me to start, because we could go back to the Supreme Court, but we could deal with like what is upon us in this moment. But
let's do that. Let's do that, and then we'll come back because there's a lot of crazies.
Well, which headlines? Every headline is pretty ominous.
It's wild out there, right? So you start with the one that was most disturbing to you.
I think what I want people to mostly understand is that we are in a moment that is on the precipice of changing everything that we have known, and not in a good way. And I think part of the reason why, in some ways, we as Black people, or the Black community, the clients of people I've been privileged to represent, are not having a kind of very specific reaction in ways that we otherwise might, is because so much of this looks like what has already been happening to us, and now it's happening to everyone. So there is that element of it.
Right.
But that also should frighten us. That also should worry us. And it also is happening at a scale that was before unimagined. And there are things happening that are not things we have seen before, that we have to be really, really conscious of. I've heard lots of people say, for example, that the whole crackdown from ICE on migrants is something that is not something that they see affecting their individual lives. But it actually does. And for all the reasons that we argued years ago when we were talking about police violence, because what we were talking about was not just one incident. We weren't just talking about Eric Garner being killed. We weren't just talking about Walter Scott being killed, or Alton Sterling, or Samuel DuBose, or any number of other people killed by police violence. And I think in some ways that got obscured by people's focus on George Floyd, which was, of course, because of that 9-minute video, the most egregious that really awakened the consciousness of lots of people, not only in this country, but around the world. We were talking about the relationship between the public, and in those instances, the Black public, and law enforcement, and the way in which this country has allowed law enforcement to operate with impunity, to behave as though they are the military, but focused on American citizens, to use force unnecessarily, to operate without oversight or discretion. These were all things we were saying in Ferguson. We were talking about officers having no badges on their uniforms. I mean, I remember, texting back and forth and tweeting it out and calling Eric Holder, who was then the Attorney General, about the fact that people were not identifying themselves. We talked then about militarized equipment coming into the community with the tanks and so forth. We talked about the level of weaponry that police were bringing into our community. All of this was part of it. We weren't just talking about individual cases. We were talking about police treating our communities like an occupied military zone.
Yeah.
And what do we see now? And what do we see now happening in Minneapolis? What do we see in Los Angeles, right? It's no longer just our communities, but it is exactly what we were talking about. This country has an unhealthy relationship with law enforcement that if we saw it in any other country, we would recognize it as a threat to democracy. And now we have basically the whole federal apparatus of law enforcement being marshaled under this unstable and highly racist president, right? Who doesn't even see any difference. He thinks ICE and ATF and Homeland Security and Border Patrol and all of the federal agencies are all at his disposal for law enforcement. And we had
Yeah.
talked also when we were working on policing about the relationship between federal authority and local police with these 287G agreements, and that we didn't want this collaboration. Well, now the collaboration is happening, except in places where some brave, governors and others have said that it shouldn't happen. We talked about, the use of this militarized weaponry. All of that we were already facing has now been scaled up. And so to the extent people think it has nothing to do with them, no. The ability to kidnap people off the street, how would you prove that you were a citizen once you're in the car and you're headed to the Dilley detention center in Texas? You haven't appeared before a judge. You haven't been able to show any papers. They just picked you up off the street. Yeah. And now you're thousands of miles away from your home. So all of this, and as they're racially profiling, right? Black people are, come from countries and are migrants also. What do I look Haitian? I don't know. Do I look like I could be from Venezuela? I've seen Black Venezuelans who look just like me. So I just think that people are too narrowly construing this and not understanding that we are in that boat and that they workshop these things always on the most vulnerable population. It used to be us with local police. Now it's migrants, but they're workshopping it so that they can expand it to take out whoever they think are people that they don't want to see as part of their citizenry.
Yeah, and I think what is so shocking to me is just how accelerated this process has happened. I mean, it's hard to believe we're only 2 years into this new administration. And just last year around this time, all of those ICE raids were happening. And it's almost weird, as if, it's, people are just desensitized to this. I mean, we think about the outrage of what happened in Minneapolis, during COVID, and there doesn't seem to be that same shock and awe and allyship that we had before. How much, I want to get back to the Supreme Court, because I do feel like courts, I work on the Hill, I'm on the Hill all the time, talking to elected officials. We know there's largely gridlock there. A lot of the stuff is being decided, in the Supreme Court. How much is the Supreme Court creating the conditions for what we're having? And then let's get back to those court cases that we were going to talk about today as well.
No question about it. No question about it, Regina. The Supreme Court actually has given license to these excesses. It begins before Trump comes back in 2024, when the Supreme Court issues its decision declaring that the president has immunity for all acts that can be deemed official acts. And this is happening in the context of the president, obviously trying to overturn the outcome of the 2020 election, which, presumably could be considered the president trying to ensure election integrity, which would be an official act. The president mishandling classified information as the president, right? It's at an official act. So obviously this court would also decide what an official act is. So that pretty much closed the door. And that leads directly to the acceleration of this second term. What Trump has always feared is going to jail. That's what mobsters is the only thing that they worry about, is whether they are going to get caught and be locked up. And for Trump, that was a great fear. That's why he was so enraged by the state prosecution of him in New York. And of course, once he became the nominee, the judge there did not, sentence him to any prison time. But the privilege decision came and it said to Trump, when you say to someone who's engaged in criminal activity, you won't be punished, that gives them license to not only continue, but to broaden and accelerate it. And that's precisely what's happened. Now, Trump had no fear. The fear that he had in the first term, that he might face accountability for some of the things he was doing. Now he knows nothing's coming. There's no accountability. And that's why you see the acceleration happening that began to happen. And then as we went forward into the presidency, the Supreme Court continued on that same vein with essentially broadening the power of the president. They got rid of a decision called Chevron, which I'm sure means nothing to anyone listening, but it was a decision that had been in place for 30, 40 years, in which the rule for the Supreme Court was that if it wasn't clear on its face the way you would interpret a particular provision, a particular statute that was under the purview of a federal agency, you would defer to the agency's interpretation because they're the experts. What do I mean by agencies? I mean like the Food and Drug Administration.
Right.
I mean like the Consumer Protection Safety Board. I mean like the Product Safety Commission, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the agencies that are part of the federal government that are supposed to keep us safe, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. That you would defer to that agency's interpretation of expertise. Well, the Supreme Court got rid of that decision, which is the Supreme Court's way of taking more power by saying, we're the experts, we will decide, and we will not defer to the agency. But then the Supreme
Court got rid of the knowledge base too. I work in public health, so I can't tell you how dangerous it is right now to not have epidemiologists, to not have people monitoring our food. I mean, we're watching explosive diarrhea across the country, but
haven't had a salad. Summertime is salad time, and we're all like going crazy. But let me add to that. Let me take it to the next level. So that's bad enough. And remember, Trump is in the process of firing heads of agencies and firing senior staff. He's also in the process of allowing Elon Musk to take his chainsaw to the federal government willy-nilly, arbitrarily cutting government agencies. And then we get this showdown around the president's ability to actually fire people from the leadership in these agencies, particularly, boards of agencies. And the Supreme Court issues that decision the same week as it issued the birthright citizenship decision. And I will tell you, Regina, I was, waiting with bated breath for birthright citizenship. Obviously, the voting rights decisions were really important. But this one is the one decision that when I woke up the next morning, I was in the court when the court issued the decision. And the next morning I woke up and I looked at my husband and I said, we're not safe. And what I meant was precisely what you were alluding to, that now that the president has the ability to simply remove, leaders in agencies because he doesn't like what they are saying or what they have concluded, we can never really be safe. And I used as an example, the Chemical Safety Board, which investigates chemical spills. And I said, well, imagine that there is a spill, a train derails, right? And a chemical spills in, a community near you. Normally the board comes in, investigates, we find out precisely what was on the train. We find out what the danger is to the community. We find out how long that danger is likely to last, and what needs to be done to protect the community. Let's suppose the manufacturer of that chemical is a friend of the president's. And that board is issuing a report that's going to say, this is the nature of the chemical. It was stored improperly, whatever conclusion they're going to make. And the president steps in and says, you know what? I'm going to fire those members of the board who investigated this and came to that conclusion. I'm going to put my own people in who are going to say that actually there's no liability, that this chemical is fine. Remember, after some of you may have lived in New York after 9/11 when they said the air is fine, right? We're still now seeing people, with cancer, but they said, come back. They said, shop. So we now are in a position where those people can be removed at the whim of the president. And I think many of us don't realize how many federal agencies, because we don't think about it, are actually keeping us safe. You cannot buy a toy for your child unless that toy had gone through the Consumer Product Safety Commission to make sure that it doesn't have pieces that are a choking hazard, that it indicates that on the box. When you buy a toy and it says 3+ or 18 months, and it's because there's been an assessment of that toy and the danger potentially to children who are younger. These are things we just take for granted. And now we can't trust any of those things. You saw what just happened. We were talking about salads, right? We discovered that there was this contaminated salad, contaminated with human feces, that was giving people explosive diarrhea, very dangerous form of diarrhea. And it was traced to a particular farm. And the head of that company then visited the White House. And after that visit to the White House, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, said, oh, we made a mistake in tracing it to that company. We don't really know where it came from, right? When it was very obvious that it was the bagged salad of that company. But they changed it on a dime, right? And they changed it on a dime because this particular company had donated $1 million to the administration. We believe, this is allegedly, I don't know this to be true, but that is certainly the appearance that it gives. So when the Supreme Court issued this decision, basically saying every federal agency is the president's to do with what he will. It means that all of those agencies that keep us safe and that work to keep us safe, as you said, scientists and so forth, now are at the whim of the president. Agencies created by Congress. Let's take the Department of Education. The Department of Education was created by Congress in 1979. It was created precisely to address and to create an infrastructure for dealing with claims of discrimination in schools. Jimmy Carter was the president when it was passed by Congress. Ronald Reagan, who was running against Jimmy Carter in 1980, as part of his platform, had his position that he wanted to close the Department of Education. So this has been a longstanding Republican thing. President Trump hired the former co-head of the Worldwide Wrestling Association to be the Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon, and she has come in and proceeded to dismantle the Department of Education, and they have taken the services given by the Department of Education to the Justice Department and the funds and so forth to the states. Now, the Department of Education not only handles discrimination complaints, it also funds every IEP in this country. IEP is the Independent Educational Program that is created for special needs students. So if you have children who are in special education and they have an IEP that is just for them, that is not funded by your state. That is funded by the federal government. So students who require special services and need disability support are funded by the Department of Education. Now that money allegedly goes to the state. Are you sure that your state's going to give that money? Let's suppose you're in a state that actually doesn't believe in IEPs. They believe in prayer for children who need special education. So now if you're in one of those states, your child is not going to get the funds that are necessary to provide them with the specific kind of educational curriculum they need to be educated. Discrimination complaints, how do you think that's going to go? Most of those now have been moved to the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice has announced that their priority is fighting discrimination against white people. This is what they have announced. Same with the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. If you believe you've been discriminated against on your job, the first thing that you have to do is to submit a notice of claim to the EEOC, and they will give you a letter that allows you to go on and sue because they will do a preliminary investigation of the claim. The head of the EEOC has announced that their primary focus is employment discrimination against white men. So all of these things that were just part of the apparatus that somehow we're thinking that has nothing to do with us, has something to do with us. And the Supreme Court has sanctioned it by, in this Slaughter decision, basically saying every one of these federal agencies, even if they were created by Congress, is under the full power and authority of the president. And if you know anything about this president, you know that this is not a president who cares about racial justice. You know that this is a president who is actively hostile to the advancement of Black people. You have watched as the Department of Defense has refused to give promotions to Black people and women at the highest levels of the military. How many Black generals and admirals have resigned because they have recognized the hostility of this government to their advancement and to their ethical carrying out of their duties. We are watching a full dismantling and a return to segregation at the highest levels of government agencies. And we've also seen over 300,000 Black women lose federal jobs as a result of DOGE. That was when the president licensed Elon Musk to cut up the government. Now, what does that mean? 300,000 Black women who lose their jobs. We're just about at the point now where the severance for those jobs has run out. We're going to begin to see housing loss. We're going to begin to see loss of cars. We're going to now be seeing the consequences of 300,000 Black women who worked for the federal government having lost their jobs as a result of this president's recklessness and activity, and the Supreme Court now sanctioning his ability to do all of that. That's just like one set of decisions around one set of things.
Right. And I think the through line, or I think what for me became very clear, is just how fragile some of the protections we thought we had really are. It's clear this is about power, but this has fundamentally changed how we think about democracy, a lot of things. Now, I know that we got into this very spirited conversation, but I can't not have like a legal scholar on here and not talk about these Supreme Court rulings. So I just want to go back to them for those who don't quite understand what happened and how they are related. If you had to just give like a top line of the most recent ones, like what do you think people most need to understand about those?
Well, the first one was the Slaughter decision, which I just talked about, which came out a week before the birthright citizenship decision. And that is about the president's control over federal agencies. And much of our life is impacted by federal agencies. The most devastating decision of the term, without question, is it's actually two decisions: Louisiana versus Calais and Allegan versus Milligan. Yeah. These are redistricting cases that came out of the state of Louisiana and the state of Alabama. And in these decisions, the Supreme Court has essentially done the final work of dismantling the Voting Rights Act. Voting Rights Act of 1965 has long been considered the most successful and consequential civil rights statute ever enacted. It was bought with the blood, sweat, and tears of ordinary Black people. It was, the assassination of Medgar Evers, who was the field secretary for the NAACP in Mississippi, whose primary concern was voting. Vernon Dahmer, who was burned to death in his home. Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was shot during a march for voting rights in Alabama. Viola Liuzzo, who was killed on her way home from the Selma March. The Selma March itself and the beatings on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, John Lewis, Ralph Abernathy, and so many others. All of this, Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner being killed in Freedom Summer, all of this was for the Fannie Lou Hamer being beaten, trying to register people to vote in Indianola, Mississippi. All of this was to ensure the ability of Black people to participate fully in the electoral process, a right we should have had since Reconstruction. We do have a constitutional amendment that says you cannot be barred from voting on account of race or color or previous condition of servitude. But the Supreme Court in the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century and all through the beginning of the 20th century, refused to take any action despite cases having been brought to enforce that provision. And so Black people largely were left from being able to vote until 1965, although technically speaking, the Constitution said you can't keep people from voting based on race. So it's really not until we get to the Civil Rights Movement and then finally that Selma March that we then get the Voting Rights Act passed in August of 1965. So after August of 1965, we begin the process of being able to elect Black representatives. And honestly, the act is focused on Black voters being able to pick who they want. And if they want Black representatives, they can elect Black representatives. So creating pathways for Black people to be able to express themselves in the political process. I want to say a word about that here too, is that the point of voting is not just the ceremonial thing of going in the booth and then getting a sticker that says I voted. The point is to be able to exercise political power so that you can change the conditions of your community.
Yes.
When the Voting Rights Act was passed,
it's not the person. It is not the person. It is what the conditions of your community.
It's the voter that you and Black people vote for white people all the time, right? Sometimes that's our candidate of choice. Sometimes a Black person's our candidate. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we have the ability to have our voice heard. Nevertheless, the election of Black representatives is a good indicator of whether or not we have that power, because obviously in places where voting is what we call racially polarized, meaning that white voters tend to vote for candidates who are not the candidates of choice for Black people. One way to tell is when Black people are voting for Black candidates, are they supported by white voters, right? And so we often use the Black elected officials as a way of gauging whether or not it's working. Well, I'll say this. There were 72 Black elected officials in the entire United States when the Voting Rights Act was enacted. 72 in the entire United States. After the Voting Rights Act, by the time we got to, the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act in 1982, because the act requires reauthorization every 25 years. In 1982, we were up to 1,000 Black elected officials around the country. But then the Supreme Court issued a decision that basically said you have to show that to show that Black people don't have an equal opportunity to participate in the political process, you have to show that there was intentional discrimination. I mean, somebody's got to say the N-word. Somebody's got to say, we are trying to keep Black people from voting. They have to show that this was intentional. And Congress comes back and says, that's not what we meant with the Voting Rights Act. We're going to amend the Voting Rights Act to make clear what we meant. What we meant was, if a voting practice or procedure has the effect of diminishing the ability of Black people to participate in the political process and vote, then it violates the Voting Rights Act. So with that amendment to the Voting Rights Act, 1982, of course, it's challenged. It goes to the Supreme Court. In 1986, the Supreme Court upholds it and says, that's what Congress is saying. They have the right to create this statute. And that's what they're saying this statute means. That's 1986. Between 1986 or 1982, when the statute was reauthorized, between 1982 and today, there are over 10,000 Black elected officials, right? So you can see how the Voting Rights Act is actually creating this pathway. Well, in these two decisions, in Louisiana versus Calais and Allen versus Milligan, the Supreme Court essentially, while saying they're not doing it, but does do it, overturns Congress's 1982 amendment to the act and goes back to the idea that you have to prove intentional discrimination. And intentional discrimination, they say they're not doing it, but they are doing it. And they're saying to prove intentional discrimination really requires some kind of, they essentially return to the smoking gun theory of you have to be able to prove that the purpose of this, not just the effect of it, the purpose of it was to discriminate against Black people. And they are saying this in the context of two cases that involve redistricting. You know, every 10 years, we do the census here in the United States that is required by the Constitution. And after the census, we redo the districts, all of the representative districts, not just the congressional districts, but the state house districts, so the judicial districts for your state judges, county council, city commission, anything you can think of goes through redistricting because there's been shifts in the population. Well, after the 2020 census, it became clear that Black voters were sufficiently enough of the electorate in the state of Louisiana and in the state of Alabama, and many of us argued in the state of South Carolina as well, to have an additional congressional district, right? To have an additional district in which Black voters could elect a candidate of their choice to Congress, right? In Alabama, there's one congressional district. Well, now two. But we're going to be back to one. Terry Sewell has been the representative from that district. And then we got a second one. And Shamari Figures is the person who was elected, in 2022, which was great. So now there were two. So that came out of the one of the cases, Allen versus Milligan. And then in Louisiana, there was going to be another district as well. And the lower courts had found that the system that was used to redistrict did in fact discriminate against Black voters, violated the Voting Rights Act. And in the case of Allen versus Milligan, even violated showed that it was intentionally discriminatory against Black voters. And the Supreme Court reversed both of those decisions in Louisiana versus Calais and Allen versus Milligan. And literally the next day, the legislatures of Louisiana, the legislatures of Tennessee, the legislatures of Texas, the legislatures of Alabama, all said, we're going to come back and redo our maps and remove existing majority Black districts. And that's what you may have seen if you know the two Justins in Tennessee, Justin Pearson and Justin Jones. Justin Pearson was running for one of those congressional seats, but that seat has been eliminated. And what they have done is taken these districts from which Black voters were able to elect a candidate of choice, and they have taken that population and fractured it and scattered and used that population to build up other Republican districts so that those districts now don't exist and Black voters don't have the ability to elect another candidate of choice. So we're not even seeing just that we're not going to be making progress. We're going backwards because this decision by the Supreme Court is being used to eliminate existing districts in which Black voters can elect their candidates of choice. And we are facing the possibility, as we did in Reconstruction, when, originally in Reconstruction, 17 Black people were elected to Congress during Reconstruction. By the time we got to the 20th century, by 1922, there was one. So we are facing, if you think it can't happen again, we are facing the loss of voice and representation after all of the sacrifices of the civil rights movement, after this powerfully successful civil rights statute, after the election of, I mean, you have a congressional Black caucus because because we're able to elect our candidates of choice.
Right.
And what the Supreme Court has now unleashed,
I mean,
silencing of the Black vote.
People will, hear the stuff and they'll say, I don't think this is intentional. I mean, I think this is absolute blacklash, as I like to call it, because we had a President Obama. What is your estimation of what the end goal is for this?
Yeah, how is that not intentional? That may have been the catalyst, but the intent is the same, right? I do think that there was a kind of trauma. Are you able to hear me? You are able to hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Great.
Yes.
I do think there was a kind of trauma around the election of President Obama, and not just the election of President Obama, but what it revealed was something that many white people didn't know, which is that there were many Black people who were highly educated, super smart, and doing well. And President Obama brought many of those people with him to Washington, D.C. He appointed many of those people to cabinet positions. I mean, they didn't know someone like Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin existed, right? Who became the Defense Secretary under Biden. But we had Togo West. We had all of these extraordinary individuals that many white people did not know existed. And I think that that was the beginning of the resentment, the beginning of the sense that Black people had gotten ahead of them in ways that they had not realized. And so what is the end goal? The end goal is to put us back in our place. The only way to do it, as you have seen, is that we have not been displacing white people. We have been achieving, and some of us have been successful, but not to the displacement of white people who continue to hold the most powerful positions in the country, who control overwhelmingly most of the wealth in the country, who own most of the land in the country and resources in the country, and who dominate the political sphere in every state in the country, right? So we're not displacing them in any way, but for them it is a zero-sum game.
Absolutely.
And so for them, it's like, if we're winning in any way, they're losing. And so they have to try to change the calculus. The interesting thing is that many of them can't keep up. They actually are not able to achieve at the highest levels. They're actually not particularly smart. They're actually not particularly experienced, strategic, and so forth. And that's how we end up with the weekend Fox News anchor as head of as Secretary of Defense. That's how we end up with a reality TV show personality as the president, right? This is how we end up with RFK at the Department of Health and Human Services. This is how we end up with the Worldwide Wrestling Federation lady at the Department of Education. This is how it happens. And so what they're doing is they're undermining the very idea of competence. You may have seen the hearings disparaging Dr. Fauci, yesterday. There is an effort to suggest to dumb down things so that they can rise to the top. In a world in which merit still matters, in which excellence still matters, there's no way Pete Hegseth becomes Secretary of Defense. No way. Right.
But it's absolutely fascinating, right? Because you're undermining it, but you're not succeeding, as you said. So
but they will destroy the whole thing if they can't be at the top. That's essentially, I believe, the message that has been conveyed to us. We will destroy this country's status in the world. We will destroy the economy. We will destroy the natural resources of this country. We will destroy this country's primacy in science. We will destroy this country's world-class universities. We will destroy everything that is valuable about this country if we can't control it. And that kind of nihilism it comes from a very irrational place. And there's nothing more irrational than racism. There's nothing more irrational than white supremacist ideology, than believing that you are fundamentally superior to another race of people. that you believe just, on your own, having achieved nothing, you are it. So we are being guided by a powerfully irrational set of decision makers.
Okay, so what can we do, right? I mean, we are eventually things are going to turn. Hopefully, in the couple of
I'm gonna
great
disagree with you.
conversations.
I'm gonna
But
disagree. I'm gonna
oh wow,
disagree.
okay,
And the
yes,
reason I'm
tell
going
us.
to disagree is just because you used the passive voice. You said
Okay,
things are going to turn, and nothing is going to turn on its own. You know this already, I know, but I'm using it to make a point, which is your first question was the question, what can we do? Because it's not going to turn. I'm putting our chances at being able to pull this country from the death spiral of authoritarianism and of shedding any modicum of democracy. We're at 50-50 at this point.
right.
And that is really bad odds.
I don't
So
disagree at all with you. Yeah, it's scary. Yes.
it's and you should be frightened, because as I'm
Mhm.
saying, we just described, the kind of danger that we're in with just like food safety. Think
Mhm.
about what's happening, the unregulated data centers, and what it's going to mean for not only the quality but access to water,
Right.
without which none of us can live.
I mean, we
You're
hear
talking
about
about the
Pastor Alley. I mean, think about this. That it is so far reaching. But I don't want to digress. I want to just what can we do?
So we have gotten to the point of having very limited options.
Okay.
I would say there are two tiers to me in these options. One, you're going to hear people say voting, and I agree with that. I honestly believe that if there's not a change in the House and the Senate, because the truth is, as excessive as President Trump is, and as disappointing as the Supreme Court has been, much of what we are experiencing can be laid at the feet of Congress, the abdication of Congress to use their
But that,
power. We have
yeah,
three branches of government, and they are supposed to check each other.
it's
And
completely
we
ineffective at that.
have a Congress that has made itself supine at the feet of the president. And I shouldn't just say Congress, a Republican-controlled Congress that has made itself supine at the feet of the president. And because they have not even fought for their own power as Congress, right? So much of this has happened. And so there has to be change. So yes, I know people say, oh, we say voting all the time. Let me tell you something, okay? We ain't getting out of this unless there's some fundamental change in the election this fall in the United States Congress. And I mean the House and the Senate. So people better really get it together. And the key is not just that you and all the people that vote, who vote. It's that you've got to convince some people who don't usually vote to vote.
Right. That's right.
You got to get people who don't vote to vote. This is what I say about Texas all the time. And so, Texas has a huge electorate. The majority of Black people in the United States live in Texas.
Mm.
And I think people just don't realize that. They think, oh, well, it's South Carolina. Yes, the states with the highest percentage of Black population, Mississippi, South Carolina, Maryland, for sure, Georgia coming in at 28%, all of the others 30% or above. But
Majority
in terms
of Black women in childbearing age are in the South.
In the South, 54% of Black people live in the South. Most of us
Yes.
live in the South, which is why when we come up with these prescriptions of what we're going to do in these, in Michigan and elsewhere, I'm like, okay, but can you do it in Alabama? If you can't, how is that helping us? So we have to make that change in Congress, and we have to ensure that we have some modicum of political power at the federal level. Even if we get that change, even if the election comes out in such a way that there's different control in Congress, then it is incumbent upon us to be very serious with those we have elected about the control that we want. I have said that I don't think anything changes until we do Supreme Court reform. We need an expanded Supreme Court. We need to add seats to the court. We currently have 9 members of the Supreme Court. That is not a number that is written anywhere. It's not in the Constitution. We have sometimes had 6. We have had 8. Shoot, we had 8 when Mitch McConnell wouldn't let President Obama appoint Merrick Garland to the court.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a number set in stone, and Congress has the power to change the number. There's nothing outrageous about it. That power sits with Congress to change the number of Supreme Court justices. We need 13. We need 13 because there are 13 federal districts, and we should have a Supreme Court justice who is assigned to each of the federal districts. And then we need to do some reform around how we select Supreme Court justices, what their ethical obligations are, And we need to tinker a little bit with some of the framework of the kinds of cases that are being funneled to them. That's essential because anything that we do will just be struck down by this Supreme Court, as we were able to see this year.
Yeah.
But then we need to be doing some things at the local level. All the things I talk about, I always talk about voting the whole ballot. You know, if you're worried about ICE making relationship with local law enforcement, then you should have been voting in your sheriff elections, because it's the sheriffs who are making common cause with ICE. But so often we skip over the sheriff election, or we don't even know who the candidates are who are running for sheriff. You need your local judges. When it says pick 3 for your Court of Appeals, you need to know who those 3 are. You need to know who your state judges are. You actually have control over that, unlike the Supreme Court that you don't have direct control over. So we've got to get serious about that ballot. The Public Safety Commission, the Railroad Commission in Texas, which sounds crazy, but they set the rates for public utilities. I mean, do you have a gas bill? Do you have a light bill? Do you have a right? So I think we have not voted. It's not just that we don't vote. It's that even those of us who do vote do not vote with the intensity that we should be voting and the kind of level of responsibility. For us as Black people, you know, I'll just say, Regina, this is a time when we have to take care of ourselves in many ways.
Yeah.
And that means...
No, I'm so glad you said that, because, you know, so many people will say, well, it's the Supreme Court, I really don't have any power, but you're actually reminding us where our power actually is.
Yes. As always, we had to do this in Reconstruction. I remind people that Reconstruction was a period in which Black people had the promise of being able to flourish. And then the post-Reconstruction period came just 20 years later. You talk about backlash, came 20 years later. We had, you know, as W.E.B. Du Bois said, a brief moment in the sun. But, you know, the period that we think of that we call the nadir or the nadir, that was a phrase that was created by Rayford Logan, the historian, which he described as the lowest period for Black people after enslavement. And that's the period from about the 1880s to the 1930 or so. That's the period in which we did so much what I call planting. And I have said this is planting time. We planted in our own community. That's when the first Black bank was chartered. That's when the first Black bank was chartered by a woman. That's when, you know, most of our fraternities and sororities were created during that period. Right. This is the period when, you know, if you're thinking about Black Wall Street, when was that? When was Black Wall Street flourishing? Right? It was burned down in 1921. So that means in the nadir, we were creating these enclaves in our community that were allowing us to be able to prosper. This was the period when there was explosion of Black churches, of HBCUs. All of this happened in a period in which rampant lynching, most Black people either sharecropping or domestic workers, but we were building, we were investing into our own communities. And those things that we invested in were the things that created a generation who could then have children to do the civil rights movement, right? Because we were able to create a circumstance in which we could stay educated, in which we had our Black churches to be able to manage our spirit and to give us training grounds for leadership, right? The person who's got the plow on during the week is clean and running the deacon board on Sunday, right? We had our own spaces where we were incubating leadership. We had our own banks and so on and so forth. So one of the things we have to do in this time, because we are but 14% of the population of this country. We're never going to be able to do everything we want to do without having some allies. But in the hard times, what we have always done is we have turned inward and we have figured out how to survive that period and how even to plant enough that we can thrive. So at the same time that we're paying attention to what our obligations are on the outside, we have to vote. We have to participate in the political process. We do have to show up at county council meetings and city council meetings. We do have to show up at town halls. We do have to let our voice be heard. We have to reserve time for investment in the Black community itself. Know who your neighbors are on the right and the left. Engage in mutual aid. You know, you're going to see people start to lose their homes, be put out of apartments. Right. You see what's happening with the economy. You see the cost of groceries. We have to start investing in one another if we're going to make it through this period intact. So there's always something that you can do. And we have to understand that's what we're being called to in this moment.
Yeah. So we talked a little, obviously we talked about unrestricted power. We talked about voting. Didn't really get into birthright citizenship as much, but I don't want to leave without talking about the temporary protected status. and that was for Haitian and Syrian immigrants. Why should we be watching this? Just talk briefly about that if you could.
Temporary protected status was created for circumstances in which people living abroad are and who have come to this country are in danger if they return home. And Haitian protected status began with the Haitian earthquake, and then since then there has been incredible political upheaval and gang violence that has made it impossible for many Haitians to return home without risking their lives. Right. This president has made it clear that he doesn't like Haiti. This is one of the countries that he referred to as an S-hole country. And obviously they're Black people. You remember the slander that was started by the Vice President, J.D. Vance, about Haitian people eating cats and dogs in Minnesota. They are a convenient scapegoat, and they're Black, which really helps, right, for the president's purposes. And so he has, he's chosen to renege temporary protected status. The Supreme Court upheld his ability to do so. And worse, the Supreme Court said that all the things that he said about Haitians, all the awful racist things he said about Haitians are not racist. That actually we can't say they're racist because he could be just saying it because they're very poor conditions in their country. It's pretty awful. Maybe some of you have said those things who are within the sound of my voice. You need to stop it. You need to understand that this white supremacy thing is a poison, and it's turned on us all the time, but it's also turned on immigrants who are from the global South. And those immigrants live in our communities. We rely on them. Just as we're seeing with food now, part of the reason our food is going to be unsafe is because many of the migrants from Central America who were taking care of our food, who were working in the chicken factories and the meat packing industry are gone. Are gone. And so we don't have the same number of hands and on our food. And, we're not going to have the same healthcare workers. Think about your elderly parents or grandparents and home healthcare workers or nursing home workers. We're not going to have those people. So honestly, we need to wake up ourselves as a Black community and understand that when they're attacking Black and brown people, they're attacking us. And the last thing I want to just say, this is very, very important, Regina, is you'll remember when President Trump, as part of his ICE interdiction, sent a young man named Kilmar Abregu Garcia to a torture prison in El Salvador. And he sent a whole bunch of other prisoners with him. And only through the valiant work of civil rights lawyers, ACLU, were they able to get those individuals back. And we'll never know if we got all of them. You should know that Trump is continuing to send people to countries to which they have no connection. These men who he sent to El Salvador were not El Salvadoran. And that prison is a known and notorious known internationally as a torture prison. He's been sending people to Rwanda. He's been sending people to what was the former Swaziland. Now it's, I think, Eswatini is the name of the country. And sending people to the Congo. But you should remember that when Trump was in the White House with the president of El Salvador, he said then to the president, now we have to work on the homegrown ones. Yeah. He was talking about U.S. prisoners.
That's what I wanted you
to and we're talking about 2 million people in U.S. prisons, and jails, the predominant number Black and brown. And believe me when I say that the plan is to ship U.S. prisoners to some of these prisons in other countries. When you have a white supremacist at that level, he doesn't think we're any different than any other Black person or Latin person. So he couldn't care less where he sends it. He doesn't care whether you have a connection with the country. You will just be sent. Yeah. Or whether you speak the language. And so for the many people who may have relatives or friends who are incarcerated, understand the plans that this man has for them. So I just will say a word about birthright citizenship. The same. Birthright citizenship is the first line, the guarantee of it in the 14th Amendment. It was created to overturn the Dred Scott decision and to ensure that Black people in this country would be full citizens. Trump likes to say it was meant for the babies of slaves. That is a lie. First of all, it wasn't focused on babies. It was focused on the 4 million Black people who now were free as a result of the end of the Civil War and the 13th Amendment. And also Black people who had already been free and living in the North because the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott case said that Black people could never be citizens. So it was meant to do that. But it also was done with the full understanding that the children of migrants born in this country would also be citizens. Birthright citizenship means you're born here and you are a citizen. And you need to understand that the purpose of trying to overturn it was to make all of us suspect, was to make it okay to walk up on anybody. And some of you should think about either yourself or some of your cousins. If somebody walked up to them and asked them to prove that they were a citizen, how would they do it? Yeah. Do they have a passport? Do they know where their birthright birth certificate is? Is it in their car? Do they carry it in their pocket? It is to make us all suspects, all people of color suspects who can be questioned about our right to belong in this country. The decision came out the right way. The Supreme Court upheld birthright citizenship, but it was really a split decision. It was a 5-4 decision. Yeah. And there are going to be efforts in Congress to try to pass some legislation that will give the president authority to strip birthright citizenship. So be on the lookout. Understand it was a narrow miss, and it has everything to do with us.
Wow. I can't thank you enough. For those of us that say, you know what, I refuse to accept the inevitable. I'm not going to let this happen. Like, what can we hold on to? I know it's a heavy and maybe not a question you can answer, but you know, we are fighters.
We come from what we come from. You know, I say to people all the time, I was trained in the tradition of Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall, right? And in 1935, they decided that they were going to break the back of Jim Crow. That's how Houston described it. Now, there was absolutely nothing in America in 1935 that would make you think you could break the back of Jim Crow. Once again, this is the highest time of lynching, especially the 1930s. You know, Black people, domestic workers, sharecroppers. Jim Crow is a way of life. For Marshall and Houston, they have only lived in Jim Crow, right? In Baltimore and Washington, D.C. Their parents have only lived in Jim Crow. So they don't know anything else, right? Thurgood Marshall is the grandson of enslaved people, right? So you're talking about slavery to Jim Crow. That's all they know. And yet they decide that they're going to break the back of Jim Crow. And between 1935 and 1954, when they finally are successful in Brown versus Board of Education, is not even 20 years. So what does that say to us? Is two things. One, we have the ability to dream of things that we have never seen, right? To dream of a system of justice, to dream of a way of being in this country, even though we've never seen it. Yeah. We have the discipline to work towards that dream. We have figured out how to stay alive and survive through the worst of times, as I was just talking about the nadir, while still planting seeds in our community. We're not going anywhere. And so we have that in us. And if we remember who we are and who we come from and what that resilience means, what it means to be descended from people who were treated as the worst of people, what it means to be descended from people who were enslaved either here or in the Caribbean, to understand what it means that you're here, what it has to say about those people whose blood runs in your veins. That's what allows us to be able to confront this moment with a sense of power. And the last thing I would say, Regina, is I really beg of you all to please take seriously your jury service. We complain a lot about the justice system and about the criminal justice system. And yet most people try to get out of jury service. And I'm really over it at this point. We need your faces on that jury. You see what's happening in DC with these trumped up charges, charging that man with like, destroying the reflecting pool that obviously have been destroyed by Trump's crew, right? Or, accusing people of assaulting National Guard officers. We need people to be sitting on those juries. Yeah. And so you can't decide that your convenience is more important than that civic duty, which is one of the ways that we can participate in the justice system and try to make it more just.
That is an excellent point. And I mean, if they want to disqualify you because they think you're going to be more sympathetic, let that happen. But we need to be there. You know what? The time is absolutely flown by. Tell us where people can follow you or support your work.
You can follow me on social media, on Instagram, on Substack, on Threads or Blue Sky. And, I now lead the 14th Amendment Center for Law and Democracy, which I founded at Howard Law School. We have a wonderful website, 14th Amendment CTR.org, 14th Amendment CTR.org. Lots of resources for you to understand the Reconstruction period and what happened to us in that period and what are the lessons that we can glean from it. And we try to keep a lot of resources there for you. So please do visit the website and please do follow on social media.
And please absolutely support this incredible and very important work. Thank you so much, Sherrilyn. I always appreciate conversations that don't just give us answers like you did, but really leave us asking deeper questions. And today's conversation reminds us that every movement for justice has to answer questions for itself. Before we close, I'd like to take this opportunity to give this episode's narrative power note. Now, we often think about the biggest battles for justice happening in the courtrooms, but history tells us something very different. The civil rights movement didn't begin with a Supreme Court decision. It began with ordinary people who refused to accept the stories they had been told about who belonged, who mattered, and what was possible. As Ella Baker reminded us, give people light and they will find the way. It reflects that real leadership isn't about telling people what to think. It's about what's helping people see more clearly. That's what narrative power is. It's helping people see things differently, see one another differently, and imagine a future that doesn't exist yet, but could. Like Sherrilyn said, to dream, to make things possible for the next generation that follows. Because before a law changes, before a policy changes, before a culture changes, the story has to change. And that's narrative power. Thank you for spending time with us today. If today's conversation challenged you, made you think, or helps you connect dots you hadn't considered before, I hope you will share it with someone else. In fact, please share it with 5 of your friends. We need to make sure we show up because understanding these issues may be limited to, not to just people like me or policy experts or lawyers. They shouldn't be. There should be for people that need to understand that it's all about all of us and this country that we are building together. Thank you for joining us on Outspoken. Be sure to follow our work. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and on Instagram, and subscribe to wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of one another, keep asking these very good questions, keep building community, and above all, stay outspoken. Thank you.